Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining Trish and I as we talk about Mohawk language today.
Sego Karen, Sego everybody joining us. This is a slightly recycled presentation, first done in 2015, but we've kind of updated it and hopefully made it a bit more up to date, perhaps. Yeah, Karen, we're a bit more up to date. Yeah. So, but something struck me recently. I was doing something and I was taking a look at the census records, and 100 years ago this year, there was a federal census, 1921. And the territory that was then known as the Tyendinaga Indian Reserve was enumerated. And for every individual named as living on the territory, the mother tongue was listed as Mohawk. Every single person. Wow. And when you looked a little bit at the families living in Deserano or the families living in Shannonville, not everybody's mother tongue was Mohawk, but a good portion of people, yes, it was. So what we're going to try to do today is to explain the story of the language and what happened to it and what is happening to it. I'm going to start with the problems in trying to tell this story because it's not easy. So most of the historical documentation we have is not in the language. We have communication between the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte and government officials. That's mainly in English. Often that communication, the historical communication between MBQ and officials was done through intermediaries like the missionaries, Saltram Gibbons, and the missionaries who came after him. Sometimes there were other people who were brought in to write letters on behalf, such as the schoolmaster, William Port. He wrote letters on behalf of MBQ, but they're in English. Petitions directly from the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte to government we found are mainly in English. And so clues to the usage of the language in the community are not easy to find, and they're just in a huge variety of documents. So I've got a veritable smorgasbord of stuff to share with you today. So, but if there are folks out there who really would like to see early documents in the language, some do exist. And there are letters by Captain John and others in a collection called the Claus Papers. And also Captain John, he did a condolence ceremony in 1782, and it was written into the form of a paper called a Mohawk Form of Ritual Condolence, and that is in the language with a translation. So these are really, really neat 18th century documents in the language. We'll start in the late 18th century, and from the time of the landing, basically, from 1784. At the very, very beginning of the community, it was really, really important. It was highly desired that the community had a school teacher. And the community thought that it was very important that this teacher know the language. So in April 1784, Captain John said in a letter that he wanted the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, and Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte wanted Mr. Vincent, who was a Wendat Huron man, and spoke about his language skills.
So this is reading number 1. We think Mr. Vincent very capable. We find he will likewise answer another good purpose, which is to be interpreter to our minister, as he speaks our language as well as his own, and had an English education in Dartmouth College, and shows a great desire of living with us in our new settlement.
Right. So in 1785, the Reverend John Stewart, who was a minister of the Church of England based in Kingston, and he was the man who provided religious services to the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte every once in a while, he also wrote about Mr. Vincent.
But those of the Mohawks who are gone to Quinte intend to remain there in hopes of having the advantages of a missionary, schoolmaster, and church. For this purpose, Mr. Stewart has recommended to the Society, with the approbation of Sir John Johnson and Colonel Claus, a Mr. Louis Vincent, a young Loretto Indian, who understands their language, is a good interpreter, and has had a tolerable education, and gain some competent knowledge both of the French and English languages, to be catechist and schoolmaster there. And the society have accordingly confirmed the appointment.
Right. So Mr. Vincent is with the community for a little while. So in 1788, Reverend Stewart, again in a letter, mentions Mr. Vincent.
Mr. Vincent has been diligent in his duty as catechist and schoolmaster and has made an amazing progress in acquiring the Mohawk language. With his assistance, Mr. Stewart is preparing a translation of St. Matthew's Gospel, which he intends to read by way of lessons to the Mohawks on the Sundays he preaches.
Okay, so there he's, the teacher's important, but the teacher learning the language is important. So in 1800, we have a very important document, which shows indirect evidence that the language was predominant in the community. The document is what we refer to as the Minutes of 1800. And there were 2 interpreters were needed to do this particular document. And the speeches, as they appear in English, because that's the only version we have, is an English one, shows patterns of what I call Mohawk speech language, oratory language, such as the following statement made by Captain John.
I informed Colonel Claus I was not fond of going to the Grand River, owing to their being so near to the Americans, and told him I thought I could not live in peace so near these people, and made choice of this place as being at a greater distance from them. The Americans are like a worm that cuts off the corn as soon as it appears.
It's a good line. It's a very good line.
No.
In the time of the War of 1812, we have a journal of Lieutenant John Lecouture of the 104th Foot, in which he mentions the language.
On Sunday, we went to the Mohawk church. The minister or reader was an Indian chief. The squaws were on one side and the Indian men on the other. None looked up as we entered, though my red uniform was enough to attract notice in some churches that I have entered. The reader has a fine sonorous voice and read very impressively. After having witnessed these men scalping, looting, yelling, and carousing in the upper part of the province, it was very striking and imposing to behold them listening to the divine truths of Christianity. I believe it was a translation of St. John's Gospel into the Mohawk language, one of the many blessings conferred on the American race by the glorious British and Foreign Bible Society. The squaws sung their hymns sweetly, plaintively.
Right, so it's church service, but it's in Mohawk.
Mm-hmm.
So, in 1813, we have a letter from John Ferguson, and he was at that time the resident agent at Kingston, and he was responsible for looking after the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, and he refers to language.
Captain Isaac left one son, who is a well-behaved man, but cannot read or write English. He speaks a little, but not so as to be unable to interpret. He writes Mohawk. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, yeah. In 1815, we have another letter from John Ferguson, again referring to language.
Although the Mohawks of Bay of Quinte generally speak English, yet they will not act as interpreter upon any public occasion, which has kept me much in the dark. So like you said, John Ferguson, husband of one of Molly Brant's daughters.
Exactly.
Doesn't know any Mohawk.
Doesn't know Mohawk. Ended up being appointed as interpreter to the community, but did not know the language.
Wonderful.
Yeah. In a little bit later, in 1831, we have a petition from the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, which again shows these interesting speech patterns, as if it had been translated directly from the language.
We have come to the unanimous determination of removing the white intruders and lessees from our tract. And on that behalf, we humbly solicit the interference of Your Excellency was pleased to promise when you last visited us. A list of the persons who have illegally obtained leases from individual Indians is annexed to this memorial. Among them, some appear to have greater pretensions than others, but as Your Excellency told us that all such as were not obtained with the unanimous consent of the nation were illegal, and we think it better to remove all. For if we remove some and suffer others to remain, it will be a cause of jealousy amongst them. And if some be left, it will be like cutting down a tree at an unseasonable period of the year, leaving the roots to spread and grow again. And in a short time, it will overspread all our land again. Or like permitting one thistle stalk to remain undestroyed, the wind will soon disperse its seeds, and our tract will soon be overrun again.
It's lovely, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
so visual. In 1832, we have a letter from the missionary Saltern Gibbons commenting on the lack of English skills among the children. He says they are, quote, ignorant of the English language, close quote. But Gibbons also mentions regarding the Mohawk language that the school teacher, Mr. Delaney, is, quote, learning the language rapidly, close quote. So there we go. We're into the 1830s and it's still needed by the school teacher. It would be appreciated if the school teacher had it. This is all good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
In 1837, we have some Mohawk names in a petition. Now this is fairly rare for Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, so this is a really nice document.
And the names I will probably butcher, but apologies. Jonas Haniaese, Joseph Haniaes, Dewanadoga, Wagarimtane, Sehadak Heta.
Right. So, and I was talking about that smorgasbord of documents. Sometimes all we have is a reference that they had to have an interpreter. So, if they had to have an interpreter, that person was either unwilling or unable to speak in English for their own reasons, whatever they may be. So in 1834, March 24th, we have a letter from Saltern Gibbons saying that the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte is sending a chief and interpreter to the lieutenant governor, quote, to make an oral expression of their wants. I think that's an important thing. In 1839, a community member, Brant Jr., was accused of murder, and there was a trial. And during that trial, John Culbertson was sworn in as interpreter, and that would be for people doing testimony. In an 1840 newspaper article by the missionary Saltern Gibbons, he documents the language use in the church services, etc. We have a document from 1851 where Abraham Brant is listed as interpreter. In 1855, we have our jugglery/witchcraft trial. And in that, David Smith was sworn in as interpreter of the accused, Margaret Brant. And in 1883, for one of the surrenders, an interpreter was used. And it was Samson Green, who also happened to be chief at the time. So we don't have it in the language, but we know it's in the language because interpreters were needed. So it's obviously core. It's for important stuff like going and talking to the lieutenant governor. It's important for court cases. It's described as being a language in the church services. It's surrenders. Obviously it's still there. It's still very, very central to the community. In the 20th century, we have a document from 1901, and it also has Mohawk names on it. It was for the death of Queen Victoria. It was a letter of condolence sent by to Edward VII, and it was signed by the men representing MBQ. So here are the names.
The Gawaranda, Chief Andrew T.C. Miracle, Anosutka, Samson Green, Dow Claus, Gawandeso, John C. Miracle, and Ganoyandu.
Right. And that's one of the things that John C. Miracle, that was what I was saying to you earlier, Karen, was that it wasn't him because he died in 1899. So somebody else had that name. I just don't know who it is. In the council minutes, the elected council of that time is Chief Andrew Miracle, Samson Green, Dow Claus, Daniel H. Miracle and James K. Hill. So I don't know which of the last two.
So one of them was going decimal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Another source for references to the language is a thing called general council meetings. And so when we talk about council meetings, there were two kinds. There was the actual council meeting, chiefs when they were all chiefs and councilors. But then they had these other public meetings, these general councils, to make decisions on big issues, to put it out there before the community. And sometimes there were a lot of people attended these general councils. And so we have some descriptions of these. In February 1908, there was a general council with 90 to 100 people attending, held to discuss a possible surrender of land northwest of the Turton Pen Shannoville lease area.
After a lengthy discussion, mostly in Mohawk, in an orderly manner.
Mm-hmm. And in September of 1908, there was a general council with about 80 people attending.
Several matters of importance to the band were brought up and discussed, partly in Mohawk and English.
And in 1912, there was a general meeting with 50 or 60 people attending.
The matter of surrendering a block of land adjoining the English church near Shannonville to build a parsonage on was then discussed. After considerable discussion, mostly in Mohawk, it was moved by Nicholas Barnhart, seconded by Isaac Green, that this band refuses to surrender any more land from the reserve. Carried.
So other sources, sometimes you get references to the use of the language when there's a dispute about something, a land dispute where you have people in conflict, a land dispute, or maybe a dispute over an estate. And so we have testimony from the Peter Barty estate case from 1912.
In testimony by Nelson S. Miracle, given 2nd day of May, 1912, the minister asked the late Peter Barty how he wanted to have the property left, but he made no reply when Daniel Miracle, the beneficiary in said will, spoke to the late Peter Barty in Mohawk, asking him how he wanted the will made. And the late Peter Barty said, "I will give everything to you to dispose of as you know best." Then Daniel Miracle said to him in Mohawk, "Uncle, you can't do that. You've got to give it to me out and out." I spoke to Daniel Miracle in Mohawk and said, "Dan, you don't understand what he means. He wants to leave it to you to dispose of as it ought to be by law, as you know." So this was on his deathbed.
Yes, on his deathbed. And so from the same file, we have testimony of Magdalene Miracle, Charlotte John, Nancy Hill, and John D. Hill, dated the 14th of May, 1912, which states
that this all took place in presence of all of us who were all present together at the same time, and that Daniel H. Miracle, who is a member of the council for the year 1912 and has been for some years, who was also present on the said occasion speaking in Mohawk to the said deceased Peter Barty, advised him that he must make some disposition of his affairs and requested him to speak up so that it might be known what disposition he wanted made of his property.
Right. And in this particular file, the documents tell us that
Jack Smart sworn as interpreter for Charlotte John, Samson Green sworn as interpreter for Nancy Hill.
Yeah. But this is quite a complicated estate file, and there was a big fight about how things were to be divided up. And in 1913, the council wanted the whole estate file issue reopened. And so we have a document that states the following.
The agent reported in March 1913 that Mrs. Magdalene Miracle was not allowed to give her evidence through an interpreter, notwithstanding the fact that she can speak English. However, the fact is she did give her evidence through Mr. Samson Green as her interpreter, and I must say that his answers, as alleged to have been given to questions as answered by her, was not what I expected from him, as he was taken to task 4 times by Chief Joseph J. Hill for not correctly interpreting the answers to questions as given by her. Your Mr. Parker can vouch for this.
So there's that actual reference because the interpretation might have been a bit dodgy.
Apparently.
Maybe ulterior motives, I don't know. So the documents that we have reflect the fact that the language was used actively within the community, at community meetings to discuss important issues, at the deathbed of those giving their final instructions, during investigations. Interpreters were needed by government officials. So, you know, it's fairly vibrant still. And you have, obviously you have people who, although they can speak English, for giving testimony, they would refuse, right?
They won't do it.
Yeah. So when did it all change? What happened? What happened? Although there must have been pressure on the language at the end of the 19th century, you know, Deserana was a pretty happening place then, and Shannonville too. So there must have been pressure from either side, and Belleville and the whole economic thing. But I think it really intensified in 1920, because in 1920, the federal government changed the rules about education on reserves. So prior to this time, MBQ had a rather sophisticated system of day schools. They had their own school trustees. They had been involved in the hiring of teachers. So for an example, Lydia Hill, a community member, was hired as a teacher in 1870. Now also graduates from the Mohawk Institute came in to be teachers, and these teachers would have either been speakers or potentially familiar with the language. But in 1920, the federal government passed an act to amend the Indian Act, and it was going to change everything.
His Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate and House of Commons of Canada, enacts as follows. 1. Sections 9 and 11 of the Indian Act, Revised Statutes of Canada, 1906, Chapter 81, and Section 10 of the said Act, as enacted by Chapter 35 of the Statutes of 1914, are repealed, and the following are substituted therefore. 9.1. The Governor and Council may establish a day schools in any Indian reserve for the children of such reserve. B, industrial or boarding schools for the Indian children of any reserve or reserves or any district or territory designated by the Superintendent General. 2, any school or institution, the managing authorities of which have entered into a written agreement with the Superintendent General to admit Indian children and provide them with board, lodging, and instruction, may be declared by the Governor in Council to be an industrial school or a boarding school for the purposes of this Act. 3, the Superintendent General may provide for the transport of Indian children to and from the boarding or industrial schools to which they are assigned, including transportation to and from such schools for the annual vacations. 4, the Superintendent General shall have the power to make regulations prescribing a standard for the buildings, equipment, teaching, and discipline of and in all schools, and for the inspection of such schools. 5, the chief and council of any band that has children in a school shall have the right to inspect such school of such reasonable times as may be agreed upon by the Indian agent and the principal of the school.
Right. So why did they do this? What was the reasoning behind taking control of education in this way under the Indian Act? Well, it was all about getting and maintaining control. Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs at the time, believed that schooling controlled by the government would result in more enfranchisements. And this would help reduce the number of status Indians and get rid of, quote, the Indian problem. So here is a quote from Duncan Campbell Scott.
I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that this country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. That is my whole point. I do not want to pass into the citizens class people who are paupers. This is not the intention of the bill. But after 100 years, after being in close contact with civilization, it is enervating to the individual or to a band to continue in that state of tutelage when he or they are able to take their positions as British citizens or Canadian citizens to support themselves and stand alone. That has been the whole purpose of Indian education and advancement since the earliest times. One of the very earliest enactments was to provide for the enfranchisement of the Indian. So it is written in our law that the Indian was eventually to become enfranchised. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole object of this bill.
Well, there it is in a nutshell.
Mhm.
But the language continued to be used. So in 1921, it was used by the Thunderwater counselors at the Bay of Quinte, and it was used to aggravate the department officials because the Thunderwater supporters had no time for Department of Indian Affairs officials. So the following is an extract from a memorandum dated the 17th of August, 1921 from Inspector C. Parker of Indian Affairs to J.D. McLean, Secretary of Indian Affairs in Ottawa.
The matters referred to in the attached communication were not brought up of the General Council, which I attended in June. The council opened at 2 p.m. and I advised the Indians that I would leave at 5 p.m. to catch my train. For the 3 hours I was there, they talked almost entirely in Mohawk, and so far as I could learn, it was mostly a case of calling each other names. So they talked until he left.
Now, who knows what they did after he was gone, right? So another really important source of information about the language in the community in the 20th century comes from community members themselves. And further information can be found in Beth Brandt's 1995 book, I'll Sing Till the Day I Die. And we have a group of selections from the book here.
Eva Brandt Miracle, born 1896. My mother and dad spoke Mohawk, but I'll tell you something. In my generation, we were not allowed to say one word of Mohawk language. If you did, you got the strap, and that was the government that did that. So this is why we don't understand the Mohawk language, and that's a shame. The grown-ups always spoke the language to one another, and they did to us kids until we went to school. And then they were afraid to talk to the children in Mohawk for fear of what might happen, if the kids would be taken away or punished. Here, the government just took over and said we couldn't talk it no more. There was always a stool pigeon at school. Oh, that so-and-so is talking Mohawk out there. Well, you got called in and the stool pigeon got the chocolate bar and you got the strap. You didn't dare say one word in Mohawk, not one word. And then from Susie James Lynch, born 1902. If you want me to talk Indian, I will. I guess I'm the only one that talks Mohawk anymore around here. We were raised, all spoke Mohawk. We were lucky. After I got working, that's where I learned English. Maybe it was good I didn't get schooling, or I might have lost my language too. And from Helen Brant Spencer, born 1911. My mother and father spoke Mohawk, but no, we didn't. And that's sad because we should know our own language. I can say a few words, but very few. When my father started school, and I'm sure this is true of your grandfather too, when they started school, they couldn't talk English. And from Marjorie Hill, born 1914, everybody spoke Mohawk then, but they'd stop talking when the children came around because the schools taught that speaking Mohawk was not the thing to do. So the folks clammed up and tried to only speak English with the children. Melville Hill, born 1918. My mother and father spoke the language, but you see, they took the language away from us when I got to school. They would punish us at the mission school. There's a few of the old timers still got the language, but I was punished. We all were. Darn government taking away the language. And Helen Miracle Brandt and Cameron Brandt. Helen, we spoke Mohawk in the family. I still speak it when I find somebody to talk it. Cameron, we all spoke Mohawk. I really don't understand why it stopped. I guess the government didn't like it. So much of what we did, the government didn't like. Helen, yes, but they are teaching the kids Mohawk at the school. That's good. Cameron, yeah, they should have been teaching it all along. So much of the old words could tell you about your people. Maybe if the kids are learning Mohawk, they'll learn about us. I find that so touching. Lena Cyril Pfefferly, born 1921. When my mother started school, she couldn't speak a word of English. At that time, they wouldn't let you speak Mohawk. And when people saw how it was, they just stopped teaching their children Mohawk. What was the use if you were just going to be punished for it? Ada Miracle Doreen, born 1926. My mother and dad always talked Mohawk, but I never talked it. We weren't supposed to, you know. The older folks said not to speak it because they used to get a beating in school if they spoke it. Some people might say, what use is it to know Mohawk now? But I say we got to learn it and relearn it. So we will always have it and it will never be taken from us again. Earl Hill, born 1928. My father was an electrician. Mom stayed at home and looked after the house. All the folks spoke Mohawk, but they didn't teach us because late as 68, we weren't allowed to talk it. It was against the law to talk your own language and try to promote it. I know some Mohawk, not all of it. I'm not fluent by no means, but my grandfather and grandmother talked to me all the time in Mohawk. Frida Brandt Baptiste, born 1929. My mother and father always spoke Mohawk, but when we were inside the house, they spoke English. When I was little, when they didn't want us to know what they were saying, they talked Indian. I wish they would have talked it to me. We always know when they didn't want us to know, and I would have liked to learn to talk in my own language, eh?
So that's one collection. And we're lucky enough to have another collection from our oral history project. So I'll ask Karen to give us another collection of selections.
So from Verna Miracle Alkenbrack, daughter of Peter Miracle and Amita Claus, both parents fluent in the language and spoke it to each other. Claude Barty, son of Vince Barty and Irene Howard. His father spoke the language. Claude speaks little but understands it. From Marlene Brandt Castellano, her father, Hubert Brandt, did not speak Mohawk, but it was her mother's first language. Her maternal grandfather, Harry Hill, spoke Mohawk with Marlene's mother, Pearl. Mike Brandt, son of Mike Brandt and Margaret Miracle, not allowed to speak Mohawk at school. Everyone asked to spy on one another. If anyone told the teacher, we would get the strap. If anyone proved to be a spy, then they had a reception after school waiting outside. Ada Miracle Doreen, daughter of Frank Miracle and Louisa Brandt. Whole family spoke Mohawk. 2 brothers and sisters could all talk Mohawk. They even used it in school as long as they could. But once they couldn't use it anymore, well, then it was always English at home. Remembered parents speaking it. Catherine Hill and Austin Fuller. Catherine's father, Herman Hill, spoke the language. Her mother, Blanche May Miracle, understood it. In Catherine's family, everything was Mohawk, and we had to learn it or else. Phyllis Green, daughter of Abel Green and Dora Brandt. Mohawk was spoken in our home when our grandparents came. Mom could speak, Dad could understand it. The only other one who spoke it was my brother Raymond, because he stayed at my grandparents' most of the time. I can't speak it or understand it because in those days, they would send you outside to play. You were seen and not heard. Noble Hill, son of Harry Hill and Geraldine Ciro. I understand Mohawk, but I can't talk it. Stan Hill, son of Oliver Hill and Effie Barnhart. His dad could understand it, but not speak it. His mother could speak it, but would never talk it. But Muriel, Stan's wife, could speak it and used to talk it all the time. Muriel was the daughter of Herman Hill and Blanche May Miracle. Willard Hill, son of Andrew Hill and Catherine Miracle, Sarah Catherine Miracle. My parents could speak it, but they didn't force it on me. Well, I understand it was sort of frowned on by the government of the time. My grandparents could speak it. I picked up the odd word, but well, I haven't used it in so long. William Ike Hill, son of John S. Hill and Lydia Smart. I do speak it. I always have, except at school. When I started at school, I didn't understand English. It was surely different. Didn't know what the deuce was going on. It was a bad situation. If we even said one word of Mohawk, we would get the strap. The Indian agent told everyone to tell on one another if they heard even one word spoken, even if we were in the playground at the school. The teacher didn't want to give us the strap sometimes, but she was ordered to do it. Jean Miracle John, daughter of Ira Miracle and Bertha Culbertson. Her father spoke it when the children were going to school. We didn't dare speak Mohawk, but he would speak Mohawk to my mother. Mother didn't speak it, but she understands it.
So
Now, you did mention that Stan spoke to his cat in
he
Mohawk.
he did. So when I started working for the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, that was 1987, and I hardly heard Mohawk at all. But Velma took me to meet her mom and dad, and Stan would sit in his chair with the cat, and he would speak Mohawk to the cat. And that was the first Mohawk I heard, like somebody speaking it. So I remember that fondly. I really, really do. So that was my honey yuxa. That was what I learned from Stan and Velma. Oh no, it was excellent. And one other note, the stories that they talked about with children who did not really have a command of English before going to the day schools. I think that continued in the community, at least into the 1940s, and perhaps even beyond that, depending on where you lived and who your family was, who looked after you. Because that idea of somebody spending a lot of time with their grandparents who had the language might mean that that child did not have a huge exposure to English before going to school. And so I think that those stories even resonate further into the century. So, so the last section that we're going to talk about is reclaiming the language. Not an easy task. It took decades to lose the speakers. It took laws, horrible laws. It took threats to children. It took intimidation. And revitalization is going to be a very long struggle. But with the help of Kelly Hill and Nyawagoa Kali, we're going to talk a little bit about the strategies and projects that are in the community that have trying to revitalize the language. So, so since the 1970s, there have been various strategies developed to reclaim the language. In the time frame of 1970 to 1980, some of the remaining speakers offered classes in their homes.
Ganadawakum became the first language speaker of the community and began documenting the language, creating resources, and teaching classes at QMS. Mohawk classes at QMS Indian Day School for grades K to 8, taught by Les Claus and Ganadawaka, and then Audrey Ciro were the teachers.
Right. And so Lorraine Hill, the grade 3 teacher at the Western Day School, began the native dance program using cassette tapes of Mohawk language social songs, and the program continued through QMS into the 1990s. In 1989, Tyendinaga Women's Circle brought in Jerry McDonald from Akwesasne to teach traditional songs and dances, which led young people to be interested in the language. Interesting time frame, that early part of the 90s coincides with the Oka crisis, and a real movement within the community for learning about language and culture.
At this time, speakers from other communities came in to do ceremonies. In 1991, Dorothy Lazor Gariwahoy from Akwesasne began teaching Mohawk at Myra Secondary.
In 1993, there was the first Mohawk immersion summer day camp at Tyendinaga, taught by Dorothy Lazor and her sister Grace Mitchell.
In 1996, 10 families formed an independent elementary immersion school. Teachers came from Ganawage, and FNTI started a part-time community adult language program taught by Ganadawakum from Western University.
Right.
In 2000, the predecessor of Jijuna Ongawana was founded to promote the language. It became TTO the following year and continues to promote language with full-time, well, not right at the moment, but they have had full-time adult immersion, language nest, and primary immersion school.
Right. and there have been other avenues as well. So that there's programs in other communities that have provided opportunities for people to go and to do immersion elsewhere. And maybe something else that we can tie into this is the building of the Longhouse and the need for speakers to do the ceremonies in the community. So you have this sort of coming together of a desire for something and a need for something, which was a great push to have speakers within the community. And so what does the future hold? Karen, tell me what TTO is doing.
Well, I really wanted to mention the website actually, because they have a presence on social media with a listing of most programs. So it's TTO-Gundege, which is KENHTEKE.org is their website, and they are on Facebook also. For the last few years in April, there have been designated Language Awareness Month, and there's many programs offered covers a wide spectrum for learning, and they usually post those on Facebook. They're on the website. There are some audiobooks. Quite a few children's books were developed and printed and made available to the Mohawk communities, and there are some audio. There are on audio on the website. So there's, it still proceeds.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's a tough slog. It was a wrench. I mean, but it was a long wrench of taking the language away, and it may be just as onerous trying to get it back. But thanks to TTO and everyone else, everyone who has been interested in the language or promotes the language. It's a good thing.
Yes, everyone who does that has a part in it and establishes a little drop of hope, I guess, and maybe inspire someone else, and so we build on each other's success. So
I think so. I love the idea of the books. It's great.
Yeah, so that was a program funded by the government, I'm going to say. So it brought people together to write these books, a group of community people, and then they were published. It's great.
I guess that's one thing we should add is that in recent times the government has recognized the damage that was done.
Yes, they have, and funding is available.
Yeah.
Although, like the biggest supporter of Jejuna Angawana has been Mohawks Bay of Quinte Council.
All right.
Kudos to them for recognizing that.
Definitely. Love it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Wow. Now we'll go with Karen.
Thanks, Trish. I always learn something when we have these little sessions. Thank you.
You are more than welcome anytime. Everybody, be safe, please. Take good care. And we'll see you again. Onigawahi.